Hello again, everyone. This is Tony with LibertyConservatives.com. I'm pleased to be joined today by Gary Palmer. Gary is a congressional candidate running for the 6th Congressional District down there in Alabama. He's in a runoff. The runoff is Tuesday, July the 15th. It's a week from today. His runoff opponent is Paul DeMarco. Gary, along with Paul DeMarco, finished in the top 2 spots back in the primary earlier this year. It was a crowded field, 7 candidates, and it's down to the final 2 here. The race is shaping up to be really positive and looking really good for Gary. We're pleased to have him on here, and Gary, welcome to LibertyConservatives.com.
Thanks for having me on, Tony.
Well, it's my pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for joining us. Now, Gary, looking back at the race, it was a crowded field, as a lot of these open seat fields have been this year. You did manage to make it off to the runoff with a pretty impressive total. And out of the 7 candidates, there's 2 remaining. Of the 5 that were defeated in that initial primary, 4 of those, the top 4 nonetheless, totaling a heck of a lot of votes, have all endorsed your candidacy. How do you see this race shaping up as you head into the home stretch now, as we're just about a week away from Election Day?
Well, if people will turn out and vote, I'm in very good shape. A July election is extremely unusual in Alabama. As a matter of fact, I cannot ever remember having an election in July. We extended the runoff period from 3 weeks to 6 weeks to accommodate overseas votes from our troops. And it's pushed it out to a time when people are just not accustomed to voting. So they're talking about a 10 or 11% turnout. So it's going to come down to whose voters are the most motivated, and who'll turn out on July 15th.
Yeah, those the runoff elections do take a hit off of the primary elections as far as turnout. And as you said, with this being sort of an extended time period in between the primary and the runoff, you certainly are going to see definitely a reduced turnout. People are, summer vacation, their minds are not necessarily on these things, and especially with that time lag that you had there of 6 weeks. But hopefully, we can get your folks down there motivated. We can do things here on our end with our folks all across the country, sharing your videos and linking to your website, and hopefully getting you up some good motivated people to get out there and turn out on Election Day. Now, one of the things of this race I thought was very interesting, when it comes down to these runoffs, sometimes things can get a little bit nasty, and they did. Paul DeMarco, it looks like he took a quote of yours, took it out of context, made it sound like you were for raising taxes. However, I've looked at your positions and looked at your positions and your writings on taxes. You're not. You say right on your website that you will not vote for a tax increase. But the issue of taxes is one that's very important to liberty-minded individuals, in the fact that not only are we looking for our taxes to remain the same or be reduced as Republicans have promised in the past, but to go even further and really reform the tax system into a new means of taxation that is more equally balanced and fairer for all. Should you get in the House, what do you see yourself doing in regards to taxes, and what types of legislation do you see yourself proposing and also voting for?
Well, one of the things that I think we need to do immediately to help jumpstart the economy again is eliminate the corporate income tax or cut it. There's about $1.5 trillion being held offshore, and not counting banks, by the way, by companies that simply are not going to come in and pay that 35% tax. That's one thing. In terms of fundamental tax reform, I'm a supporter of the fair tax. I like it because people determine how much tax they pay by how much they spend, and it promotes savings. So I would be a strong proponent of the fair tax. But I will be for cutting any taxes and cutting spending. And one of the things that I'd like to do, and I've been talking about this for about 3 or 4 years, is create a catalog of all the federal discretionary programs so that you can look through this thing and see what the program is, what it does, how many people are employed, what they spend on it, and then have a series of questions that follow on. And the first one would be, is this program relevant? If it's obsolete, we quit doing it. Next question, is it a legitimate function of government? If it isn't, you stop doing it. If it is something that needs to be done, then the next question would be, can it be done by the private sector? And if it can be, contract it out. The next question, the last two questions are really key questions. The next one would be, is it duplicated at any level of the federal government? And the General Accountability Office issued a report, I think sometime around March, and the GAO identified at least 188 programs, federal programs, that are duplicated or have, in their words, inherent inefficiencies. So some of that work's already done. But my favorite question, Tony, is it duplicated at the state level? And if it is, I would be pushing to devolve that down to the states. That would include the U.S. Department of Education. You'd have a very small U.S. Department of Education that just basically handled research and academic data, that sort of thing. But that the control of education would be at the local level. And then I would apply that to the EPA as well. Every state has a Department of Environmental Management, and as I've said on the campaign trail many times, I've never met a politician of any party that's for dirty water, dirty air, polluted soil, and cutting all the trees. And my contention is that the EPA has gone from environmental protection to becoming an economic menace. And we need to move that down to the state levels and maintain a smaller, very small EPA that would basically be responsible for writing the regulations that are duly passed by Congress and for mediating disputes between the states and being kind of clearinghouse for research. But move this stuff closer to the people where you've got more transparency, more accountability, and a whole lot more efficiency, which will ultimately mean we're spending a whole lot less money.
Absolutely. Now, Gary, you served for 24 years as the president and CEO of the Alabama Policy Institute. It's a research and education organization based obviously out of Alabama. Currently, you're still with the organization as the Chief Development Officer. And over the last 2 decades, 2.5 decades that you've been in this, so you've been, you've had your nose to the grind as far as policy and as far as, that bridge between government and the people. Have you noticed that folks are starting to tend more to wake up to the fact that the answer isn't always government to whatever question it might be? You mentioned when you talked about taxes about, taking a look at what government does and is it even a function of government? And in my experience over the last, 5 to 10 years or so, people are starting to become even more aware of the fact that government doesn't really have all the answers, and government is the one that usually creates the problems and then comes up with a solution, which is usually another government program to fix the problem that they created. So are you noticing that in your work with API that people are starting to, that tide is starting to turn away from reliance on the government and, always petitioning the government for solutions and turning back to more of a free market approach and a more of approach, where it's guided by the states and then ultimately the people?
I think we're on the verge of just a great awakening period. And it's going to cover, I think, the full spectrum of not only government being too expensive and too intrusive, but also I think what's going on at the border is indicative of the fact that we're really in a constitutional crisis. And I've realized that most people don't have an in-depth knowledge of the Constitution. They can't argue it with all the expertise and legalese of a constitutional expert. But intuitively, they revere the Constitution and they have a sense of what it means. And one of the things that they know that it means is that presidency is not an imperial presidency. I think that people are starting to wake up to that and respond to it. Obamacare also got their attention because people began to realize that the government is big enough to give you everything you want, as Larry Reid famously said. Or at least he's quoting somebody else. The government big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you've got. And they're starting to realize that now.
Yeah, in fact, I was reading one of your quotes that you had on Obamacare, is that it's not the website, it's not the rollout that was the problem, that the problem was with Obamacare, it is trying to impose on the American people. For the first time in our nation's history, you're being forced to buy a government product or pay a penalty. That's a direct quote off your site. I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that's really the crux of the issue, is that we now have the government stepping over another line, so to speak. You know, when you look at the litany of federal agencies that we have, and they've kind of regulated almost every segment of business that we have, or at least major segments of business that we have in this country. Now they're taking over to, 1/3 of the economy, not only regulating the insurance companies, which they have done, not only regulating the doctors and the hospitals and the pharmaceutical companies, which they have done for decades, but now it's regulating every man, woman, and child in this country and telling them what they have to buy, when they have to buy it, and how much they have to pay for it. Or, they're paying a penalty, which ultimately means, it's coercion. Ultimately, if you don't pay that penalty, one of these days, someone's going to show up at your house with a warrant for you for lack of paying your penalties. And that's a very dangerous situation we're in this country.
You know what agency will send that person out?
It'll be the IRS.
That's right. All the more reason for a fair tax. Here's what's going on in our economy right now. Brookings Institution, which is a moderate to liberal think tank, published a report, I don't know, back in February, March, somewhere in that time frame, and reported that in 2009, 2010, 2011, there were more businesses closed than open, and the differential was 47%. In other words, there were 47% more businesses closed than open. Well, that's very telling, because what that's telling you is people are not opening up small business, and small businesses are the engine of our economy. And I think it's because of the uncertainty and the difficulties created by Obamacare, it's the difficulties created by the EPA, and just the unbelievably intrusive regulatory environment that potential business owners have to operate under. And in addition to the Obamacare and the problems that creates, on the medical side, they've also tried to enforce what's called ICD-10. That's the International Classification for Diagnosis. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but prior to ICD-10, the doctors had well over 16,000 codes that they could use for coding diagnosis of a patient's condition. They want them to go to over 69,000, and they're going to tie Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements to that. They're literally telling doctors' offices that if you don't have the computer software installed, if you don't have the ability to implement these codes, you need to get a 6-month line of credit to keep your practice open. And people may not think about it, but healthcare is a business. A doctor's office is a small business.
Oh, yeah.
We've had doctor's offices closing everywhere, and that got postponed. It's supposed to go into effect October 1st of this year. It's been postponed until October 1st, 2015. But this will be devastating to rural healthcare delivery. Because those practices out there in those hospitals, I guarantee, are 95% plus Medicare or Medicaid, and they can't operate. So I think it's going to have a very, very bad impact, particularly in rural areas.
Oh, absolutely. And there are many out there, and myself would be included, that would say that this is all by design. While the progressives in this country will go under the guise that they're trying to help people, really what they're trying to do is they're trying to create more dependence. They're trying to get more control, because without dependence and without control, they have nothing. It goes all the way back, now you have, with the Obamacare, but it goes back to Medicare and Medicaid, welfare, food stamps, and rolling all the way back to every aspect where the government has that sort of control over people. They start giving the handouts, and the handouts then keep them in power, because without the handouts, the people are going to go the other way and vote the other side. on that, like we said earlier, there is a tide that's turning. People are waking up. There is sort of a second, revolution going on, albeit this one being more of an intellectual revolution. But it's happening within the Republican Party as well, because the Republican Party, and I've been a Republican since the age of 18, and I'm 46 years old, and have been a supporter of them. But they have been a willing accomplice, for the progressives along the way. While they've opposed things and they've tried to do things to be maybe less costly or more fiscally sound. Just opposing the mere notion that we even have some of these government programs really hasn't been done since the sort of first conservative wave that we had back in the 60s with those that were opposing the Great Society. But since that time, a lot of Republicans have been quite silent on these things. There is a group within Congress right now, numbering about 35 guys, the House Liberty Caucus. You have Justin Amash, you have Tom Massey, Raul Labrador, Trey Gowdy is part of that. It's a nice group of guys that are taking on the establishment and challenging. Do you see yourself sort of lining up with those guys and kind of being on that side of things when you get to Congress?
I do. Tim Hielskamp has been one of my strongest advocates.
Right, another member of it.
Yeah, Tim is a member from Kansas, and I know a lot of those guys and look forward to working with them.
Yeah, it's a great group of guys down there, and I hope, with this next election cycle that we may be able to see some of the guys that, the names I mentioned and the others, get into the leadership positions, because we really do need to change it just from, the Republican Party being a sort of a Democrat-light version, still supporting those big government programs, to get to really to the point where we're going to have to start turning away from things. Otherwise, we're just not going to be able to afford it anymore.
Well, what I've been telling people is that Republicans and conservatives have become experts at depressing people. Because our message, and this is what a lot of the consultants in D.C. Say the message ought to be, is to go out and talk about how bad everything is and blame Obama and blame Pelosi and blame Reid. And obviously there's a lot to blame them for. But you know what we cannot blame them for? We cannot blame them for a lack of vision for getting our country back on the right track. We can't blame them for not going out and offering solutions that make sense and offering them in an honest way. And I think that's what the party's got to do, and I think that's what the Liberty Caucus, that group of guys are really focused on. They're not focused on having a supermajority Republican. They're focused on getting the country back on the right track and doing it the right way. And that's what I think we've got to do, Tony, is we've got to get out and talk to people again. Because people are getting, I think one of the reasons why the voter turnout is getting lower, and is because we're hemorrhaging conservative voters, and that's happening because all we do is talk about how bad everything is. We need to give people a vision for getting our country back.
Right, and that's the message that Reagan took out there, and that's why Reagan was so incredibly popular and had people crossing party lines, had the Reagan Democrats, had an incredible turnout of the base, because he did have that positive message, and we need that. We need to, put people in charge of their own destiny and show them how well they can do when they are such, without interference from government, and give that positive message, as opposed to, as you said, just blaming Obama, Pelosi, and Reid for everything. And of course, yes, they are a big part of the problem. But we do need to go out there with a positive message of our own that's distinct and different from just like as I said, Democrat light version of the same old tired policies.
You mentioned Reagan. This is the 50th anniversary of his "I for Choosing" speech.
Is it really?
Yeah, and in that speech, in 1964, in that speech, he said, "This election is about whether or not we still believe in our capacity for self-government, or whether we will abandon the American Revolution and concede that a small group of intellectuals in a far-off capital can better plan our lives for us than we can plan them for ourselves."
Well, fantastic. Well, Gary, I do want to thank you once again for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Could you give everybody your website and any way that they can help you out over the next week, get you across that finish line?
Well, the web address is www.palmerforalabama.com. That's palmerforalabama.com. And if you go to that website, you can connect to our social media there. And if you're interested in contributing to the campaign, you can do it through the website. And if you know people in Alabama, if you got listeners in Alabama, friends in the 6th District, we need to get them out to vote because it's going to be a low turnout.
Fantastic. Gary, thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you the best of luck, and hopefully we'll be talking to you in a few weeks and as a victorious candidate.
Great. Thanks, Tommy.